She stole from a federal officer, Marshal Denton announced to the street, loud enough for every soul in Silver Creek to turn and stare, and assaulted one of my men. That makes her a fugitive of the United States government. He said it the way a man reads a church notice. Calm, certain, final. Violet Ames stood in the doorway of Callaway's General Store with her back against the frame and her hands open at her sides. She did not run. She had learned across too many months in too many towns that running only made men like Denton feel righteous. She counted the exits. The front door, blocked. Denton's 2 deputies fanned left and right along the boardwalk outside, thumbs hooked in their belts, enjoying the September sun on their faces. The back storeroom, possible, as if she could get past the counter without Callaway himself grabbing her first. The old man was already pressed against his shelf of flour sacks, pale as the dust on them, wanting no part of whatever this was. She counted the faces instead. 12, maybe 15 people gathered on the street. A woman with a market basket pulled her daughter close. A pair of cowboys leaned against the hitching post and watched with the lazy interest of men who had nothing at stake. A boy of about 8 climbed up on a barrel for a better view. Not one of them was going to move. She had known that before she counted. Miss Ames. Denton stepped up onto the boardwalk, his boots heavy on the planks. He was not a large man, but he wore his authority like a coat, 2 sizes too big, and he had learned to fill it. You can come quiet, or you can make this harder on yourself than it needs to be. Either way, you're coming. On what warrant? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Old habit. Necessary habit. Denton smiled. It did not reach his eyes. The warrant is being prepared in Denver as we speak. Consider this a courtesy escort. A courtesy escort. 3 armed men and a public announcement on a Saturday morning. She almost laughed. She counted her options instead. There were none. The bell above the store door rang. No one had pushed it open. It rang because the door swung inward on its own, slow and deliberate, and the man who filled the frame did not need to announce himself. He was the announcement. He was enormous, not tall the way a sapling is tall, tall the way an old pine is tall, built from the ground up with something that did not bend easily. His shirt was the color of coal dust, his forearms bare to the elbow and cross-hatched with small scars the way iron gets when it works against iron. He had a jaw like a quarry shelf and dark eyes that swept the room once and took inventory of everything in it without any visible hurry. He looked at the 2 deputies outside. He looked at Denton. He looked at Violet. Then he crossed the floor, stood beside her, and said 4 words to Marshal Denton. "That's my wife." The silence that followed had weight to it. Violet did not move. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Denton and catalogued every flicker of calculation that crossed the marshal's face, because that was where the danger lived. Not in what men said, but in the moment they decided what to do next. "Your wife." Denton repeated it slowly. "Married last spring, the Utah Territory." The big man's voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had long since stopped needing volume to be heard. "You want to drag a man's wife off the street in front of half the town, Marshal? You'd better have something more than a warrant that's being prepared." Denton's jaw tightened. He looked at Violet. He looked at the man beside her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not belief, not doubt, but the arithmetic of consequences. 3 deputies, a crowd of witnesses, a man who looked like he had been a problem before and had survived it. "This isn't finished," Denton said. "I didn't think it was." The big man held the door open, not for Denton, for her. Violet stepped through it. She did not touch his arm. She did not thank him. She walked out of Calloway's general store and across the dirt street toward the forge at the far end of town, and she counted the distance between her and the marshal's horses, and she counted the angle of the afternoon shadows, and she counted how many seconds it would take for Denton to change his arithmetic. The man fell into step beside her. He matched her pace without adjusting it. Neither of them spoke until Silver Creek's main street was behind them and the sound of the forge was ahead, the low rhythmic clang of iron still warm from the morning's work. He pushed open the heavy door. The smell of coal and hot metal rolled out to meet her. She stepped inside, and her eyes moved immediately. One door in, one window high on the east wall, a back passage half hidden behind a rack of finished ironwork. 3 exits, all better than the store. She was still cataloging the room when her gaze snagged on something beneath the main workbench. A drawer, iron-faced, with a lock so old the keyhole had gone dark with years of handling. It was the only thing in the forge that was not covered in dust or ash. Someone wiped it regularly. She reached out, almost without thinking, and let her fingers brush the cold surface of it. "Don't." One word, low, absolute. She pulled her hand back and looked at him. His face gave her nothing. He was already crossing to the water barrel, pulling off his leather apron, done with the subject as completely as if it had never happened. Violet looked at the drawer, then at the man, then at the drawer again. She filed it away. Whatever Jasper Colton was hiding under that workbench, she would find out. She always did. While you listen to this story, I want to ask, where in the world are you right now? Drop your city or country below. Every time I read those comments, I'm reminded how far a single story can travel. Silver Creek was not a cruel town by nature. It was simply a tired one. 3 years of drought had thinned the cattle herds and shortened the tempers of the men who ran them. The railroad had come through 40 miles south and taken the freight money with it. What remained was a main street of 12 buildings, a church with a broken bell, and the particular kind of pride that poor communities develop when they have nothing left to protect but their reputation. Into that town, 6 days ago, Violet Ames had walked alone. She was not what anyone would call remarkable to look at. She was broad through the shoulder and heavy through the hip, with the kind of solidity that came not from comfort, but from labor. Years of hauling ledger boxes up narrow stairs, of standing over cooking fires in her uncle's household when the kitchen girl was sick, of sleeping on a cot in the back office because Raymond Ames called it practical and she had not yet learned to call it what it was. Her dress was dark wool, travel-worn, the hem stiff with road dust. Her hair was pinned back without ceremony. Her face was plain and watchful, the kind of face that does not advertise what it is thinking. That was intentional. She had taken a room at the boarding house on the corner, paid 3 nights in advance with the last of her coin, and spent those 3 days doing what she always did in a new place. She learned it. She listened to who argued with whom at the water trough each morning. She noted which deputy took his coffee at the diner and which one preferred the saloon. She watched the stage road from her window at dusk and counted the riders coming in and the riders going out, and the ones who did neither, but simply stopped at the edge of town and looked. When Marshal Denton's party rode in on the fourth morning, she had already packed her bag. She had not packed it fast enough. Now she stood inside Jasper Colton's forge, her bag at her feet, the smell of hot iron thick in her throat, and she turned over what she knew about the man who had claimed in front of witnesses to be her husband. Not much. That was the problem. And Violet Ames did not operate well with not much. She knew his name from the sign above the forge door. She knew his hands. The left one bore a scar along the thumb that was not from forge work. Too straight and too old, the kind of scar a blade leaves when a man blocks instead of dodges. She knew he was somewhere past 40, that he lived alone, and that he had walked into Calloway's general store this morning not to buy anything but to watch, because his hands had been empty and his eyes had been already moving when he stepped through the door. She knew that the drawer under the workbench was the only thing in this building he did not want touched. That told her more than his name did. Jasper came back from the water barrel and set a tin cup on the edge of the bench nearest to her. He did not hand it to her. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply put it down and went back to his work, lifting a half-finished hinge from the cooling rack and holding it up to the light from the high window. She looked at the cup, then at him. He was not watching her. She picked it up. The water was cold and tasted faintly of iron. She drank it slowly and kept her eyes on the room. "They'll come back," she said. "I know." He turned the hinge in his hands. Denton isn't the type to let arithmetic hold him for long. He'll send a writer to Denver, get his paperwork in order, and come back with something on his side that looks like the law. "I know that, too." She set the cup down. "Then why did you do it?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the main street, a horse shook its bridle, and a woman called a name that the wind took before it arrived. The forge fire breathed low and steady. "Seemed like the thing to do," he said. It was the most useless answer she had ever received, and she had received many. She studied his profile, the stillness of it, the way his eyes tracked the metal in his hands without any urgency, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, not because she trusted him, because she did not, and she needed to know exactly how far that distance ran. She built walls the way other people built fences, quickly, from whatever was available, without worrying about whether they were beautiful. She had left a door open once for a man who had smiled the right way and spoken the right words, and she had spent 2 years afterward learning the shape of the mistake. She was not going to make it again, but she was also, at this particular moment, out of options and out of coin, with 3 U.S. His marshal's in the town behind her, and a locked drawer in the building in front of her that this silent, scarred man did not want her to touch. She pulled her bag strap up over her shoulder. "I'll need to earn my keep," she said. "I don't take charity." He glanced at her then, just once. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite anything. And then he went back to the hinge. "Can you cook?" "Better than you, most likely." He nodded once, as if that settled something. "Stove's in the back room." "Supper's your business, then." She walked toward the back passage. She did not thank him. She counted the steps between the workbench and the back door as she went. 11. And she noted the latch style, and she noted the way the afternoon light fell across the floor, and she noted without looking directly at it, the exact position of that iron drawer beneath the bench. She was not done with it. She was not done with any of this. It is easy, in a town like Silver Creek, to look away, to press yourself against a shelf of flour sacks and let the machinery of injustice run its course, because the cost of stopping it feels higher than the cost of watching. But consider this. In that doorway this morning, when 3 armed men stood against one exhausted woman, and every face on that street turned to study the ground, one man did not look away. He walked toward the problem instead. What does it take to be that person? Not the badge, not the weapon, not even the size of the man. Something older than all of that. Ask yourself honestly, if it had been you in that store, what would you have done? They left Silver Creek before dawn. Jasper did not tell her they were leaving. He appeared in the doorway of the back room at 4:30 in the morning, already dressed, already carrying, and set her bag beside the stove where she had slept on a folded blanket. She was already awake. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since Denver, and her body had stopped pretending otherwise. "Denton sent a rider south last night," Jasper said. "Saw him go." She stood up and reached for her bag before he could offer to carry it. He didn't offer. She noted that. They went out through the back of the forge, through a narrow alley that smelled of ash and wet straw, and around to the small stable behind the building where a gray mule and a dark bay horse stood in separate stalls, already saddled. The horse was large and steady-looking, the kind of animal that had seen enough of the world to stop being startled by it. The mule regarded her with one pale eye and made no judgment. "You ride?" he asked. "Well enough." He gestured to the horse. She looked at him. He was already moving toward the mule. She filed that away, too. A man who gives the better animal without discussion is either generous or strategic, and she had not yet determined which. They rode north, out of Silver Creek, along a trail that left the road within half a mile and climbed into the broken country above the valley. The sky was the color of iron filings. That particular gray that comes just before September dawn decides what it wants to be. The scrub oak on either side of the trail was turning, the leaves curling at the edges and going the color of old rust. Oh, the air had a bite to it that August had not carried. Autumn was not arriving gradually in this part of the territory. It was arriving the way most things did out here, without announcement, without apology. Violet rode slightly behind him and watched the trail with one eye and the man with the other. He sat the mule the way men sit horses when they have spent years doing it. Weight low, hands quiet, no wasted motion. His eyes moved constantly, but without urgency, scanning the ridgeline ahead, and then the slope to the left, and then the trail behind them, a rhythm so practiced it had become involuntary. She recognized it. She had seen that particular habit of watchfulness before, in men who had learned it not from caution, but from necessity. She did not ask about it. The trail steepened as the light grew. Below them, the Silver Creek shrank to a strip of gray rooftops and a single thread of chimney smoke in a valley that looked, from this height, entirely peaceful. She did not look at it long. After an hour, the scrub oak gave way to ponderosa pine, tall and widely spaced, their bark the color of dried blood in the early light. The ground beneath the horses was soft with needles, and the sound of their passage went quiet. Up here, the wind had a different voice. Lower, steadier, moving through the high branches with a patience that the valley wind did not have. Jasper stopped once to water the animals at a narrow creek that crossed the trail. She dismounted without waiting and walked the horse to the bank herself. The water was snow-melt cold and tasted clean. She cupped her hands and drank. When she straightened, she found him watching her. Not with curiosity, not with the particular look men gave women they were calculating. Something more careful than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. Though of what, she could not have said. He looked away first. She remounted without comment, and they rode on. The cabin came into view around mid-morning, a low, solid structure of notched pine logs set into the side of the slope, with a stone chimney and a roof that had been patched in 3 places with new shingles still pale against the old gray ones. A woodpile ran the full length of the south wall, stacked with the kind of obsessive precision that speaks of long winters lived alone. A small garden plot off the east corner, mostly finished now, the last of a squash vine trailing yellow across the dark soil. It was not beautiful. It was deliberate. Every part of it placed to last. She sat on the horse at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a moment. He stopped the mule beside her and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his way of giving her space to think without making a performance of it. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. 6 years. She looked at the woodpile, the chimney, the patched roof. 6 years of maintenance, of preparation, of choosing this particular slope above this particular valley, and deciding it was far enough. Far enough from what, she did not ask. Not yet. She touched her heels to the horse's sides and rode toward the cabin, counting the distance from the tree line to the door. 30 feet, open ground, no cover, and noting the angle of the slope behind the structure and the single window facing south. Old habit. Necessary habit. The first rule Violet established was simple. She did not touch his things. Not the tools hung in their precise order along the south wall, not the single tin plate he left upside down on the shelf above the stove each morning, not the stack of papers on the corner table that she could see from across the room were not letters, but maps, hand-drawn, covered in notations she did not try to read, and not the iron drawer, especially not the iron drawer which she had not forgotten and which she intended to treat, for now, as if it did not exist. It was a strategic courtesy, nothing more. Oh, she told herself that every morning, when she woke before him on the narrow cot, he had moved to the far corner of the single room, separated from his own bed by the width of the stove and a wool blanket hung from a ceiling beam that served as a wall between them. He had done it without being asked on the first night, while she sat at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee and her eyes on the door. He had moved the furniture with the quiet efficiency of a man solving a practical problem, and then he had gone to bed and said nothing, and she had sat at the table for another hour after his breathing deepened, cataloging the room in the dark. She cooked. That had been the arrangement, and she kept to it precisely. The first morning, she found dried beans, salt pork, a rope of onions, and a small sack of cornmeal. She made a pot of something that was technically soup and left it on the stove without ceremony. When she came back inside from walking the perimeter of the clearing, old habit, necessary habit, the pot was half empty, and there was a small stack of firewood beside the stove that had not been there before. She had not asked for it. He had not mentioned it. She added it to her catalog. He spent his days at a portable anvil he had set up in the lean-to beside the cabin, working on pieces he carried up in his saddlebags from the forge in town. Hinges, brackets, a set of hooks for someone's barn door. The sound of the hammer carried a steady rhythm through the cabin walls all morning, pausing at irregular intervals, resuming. She found, after the second day, just that she had started to listen for those pauses the way you listen for a clock to stop. Not consciously, just suddenly aware of the silence when it came. She did not examine that too closely. In the afternoons, he checked the snares he kept along the tree line. On the third day, he came back with 2 rabbits and set them on the table without looking at her and went to wash at the basin. She broke them down without being asked, her hands efficient and practiced, and when he came back to the table, she was already rendering the fat in the pan, and the smell of it was filling the small room with something that was almost like the idea of warmth. He sat down across from her. He watched her hands, not her face. "You've done that before," he said. "My uncle had a cook until I was 14. She kept her eyes on the pan. After that, he didn't. He said nothing, but he did not look away. She felt it, the weight of his attention, different from the attention of other men. It did not take inventory, it did not measure, it simply stayed, patient and even, the way the ponderosa pines stayed on the ridge above the cabin, indifferent to wind direction. She turned the rabbit pieces and did not look at him. He got up to add wood to the stove. His arm passed close to her shoulder, not touching, 3 or 4 inches of cold air between his sleeve and her wool dress, and she was aware of it with an acuity that annoyed her considerably. She stirred the pan and said nothing. That night she lay on her cot and listened to the wind move through the high branches and told herself with some precision exactly what was happening and exactly what it was not. On the 5th day it snowed, not heavily, a thin, early September snow that came down out of a pewter sky and settled on the garden squash and the woodpile and the mule's back and melted almost immediately, but left the air with a cold that was no longer theoretical. Violet was outside splitting kindling when it started. She did not go in. She kept splitting, the axe finding the grain of the wood with a competence she did not bother to hide, and the snow came down around her thin and quiet, and she let it land on her shoulders and melt there. She heard him stop behind her. She did not turn around. After a moment, something heavy and warm settled over her shoulders. She went still. It was a coat. His coat, canvas and fleece-lined, enormous on her, the collar coming up past her ears. It smelled of coal smoke and pine resin and something underneath both that she did not have a name for. She kept her grip on the axe handle. "I'm not cold," she said. "All right," he said, and went back inside. She stood there with his coat around her shoulders and the axe in her hands, and the snow falling on both of them, and she was furious with herself for the 30 seconds it took to set her jaw and get back to splitting wood. She wore the coat until she came inside. She folded it and set it on the bench by the door without comment. He was at the table with his maps, and he did not look up, and she went to the stove and was grateful for the excuse to have her back to the room. The 6th day brought a cold that was serious. The stove burned all night, and the water in the basin had a skim of ice on it by morning. She woke to find the fire already built up. He had risen before her, which she had not heard, which bothered her more than the cold, and a cup of coffee on the edge of the stove, still hot. She sat on the edge of her cot and looked at it. He was outside already, the sound of the axe at the woodpile steady and unhurried in the frozen morning air. She picked up the cup with both hands. The tin was almost too hot to hold. She held it anyway and let the warmth move up through her palms and into the cold stiffness of her fingers, and she looked at the fire, and she did not think about the man who had built it. She was very deliberate about not thinking about that. Later that morning, he came in to warm his hands, and she was mending the hem of her dress at the table, and he sat across from her and poured his own coffee, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Outside, a branch dropped its snow load with a soft collapse. The mule made a complaint from the lean-to and fell silent. "Tell me about Denver," he said. She did not look up from the needle. Why? Because Denton didn't ride 6 hours from Denver to collect a thief. A pause. "And you don't move like a thief." She bit the thread off, smoothed the hem with her thumb, considered, for the 4th time since arriving at this cabin, exactly how much of the truth was useful and exactly how much was exposure. "My uncle is a land broker," she said finally. "Raymond Ames. He's been selling the same parcels twice, forging signatures on title deeds, bribing the federal land office in Denver to look the other way." She set the dress down and looked at him. "I found his ledgers. I made copies. When I went to the marshal's office, Denton was the one who came to take my statement." He was very still. "Denton is on Raymond's payroll," she said. "He filed the theft charge himself. Assault on a federal officer was added later for weight." She picked the dress back up. "I've been moving since March." The fire breathed. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, once, twice, his thumb moving over the rim with the unconscious repetition of a man thinking through something he has already half decided. "How many copies of the ledgers?" he asked. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The steadiness of his eyes, the way the question had come out not with alarm, but with the practiced calm of someone who understood the architecture of this kind of problem from the inside. "1," she said, "hidden." She paused. "You know how this works?" It was not a question, it was a test. He met her eyes. "I know how it works." He did not elaborate. She did not push. But something shifted in the air between them, a fraction of a degree, the way a door shifts when a room's temperature changes, not open, not closed, but no longer exactly where it was. That night, she woke to a sound from his side of the hanging blanket, low, ragged, not quite a word. She lay still and listened, and it came again, a sharp intake of breath, then silence, then the slow, deliberate exhale of a man pulling himself back from somewhere he did not want to be. She did not speak. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe himself back to steady, and she stared at the ceiling and felt, without wanting to, the particular weight of a person whose nightmares have shape and history and a specific geography. She knew that weight. She had carried her own version of it since March. In the morning, he was at the stove before her as always, and his face was the same closed, careful face it always was. And she put on her boots and her coat and went out to check the snares without saying anything. And that was the most honest courtesy she knew how to offer. On the 9th day, his hand covered hers. It was an accident, or close enough to one. She was pulling a cast-iron pot from the back of the stove shelf, heavy, awkward, and she had misjudged the angle. And it lurched, and his hand came from beside her and steadied it, his fingers closing over her knuckles, his palm pressing warm and certain over the back of her hand. 2 seconds, 3. Then he took the pot, set it on the trivet, and stepped back. She turned to the shelf and found something to straighten that did not need straightening. Her heart was performing an operation she had not authorized, and she was deeply displeased about it. She could feel the exact shape of where his hand had been for the rest of the afternoon. Not painfully, just present. The way a brand stays warm long after the iron is removed. She caught herself pressing her right hand flat against her thigh as she worked, as if she could still feel the weight of it. And she stopped, and she was curt with herself about it in the privacy of her own thoughts. He split wood until dark. She watched him through the window twice and hated that she had. The 10th day. He came in with a grouse he had taken at the tree line and set it on the table, and she was standing with her back to the room, reaching up to the high shelf for the salt. And when she turned around, he was right there, closer than she had accounted for, the table between them, but not much else. And he did not step back, and neither did she. He was looking at her face, not her dress or her hands or the work she was doing, her face, her eyes, specifically, with a focus that was quiet and complete, and that she felt go straight through every wall she had built and cataloged without her permission. "You're afraid," he said very low. "I'm not afraid of anything," she said, which was not entirely true, and which she suspected he knew. "Not of me." Something moved in his expression, patient and certain. "Afraid of what it means if you stop watching the door." The fire, the wind in the pines, the grouse on the table between them. She looked at him for 3 seconds longer than was strategic. "I've watched the door my whole life," she said. "I'm very good at it." "I know." He picked up the grouse and carried it to the basin. "Supper will be late if we don't start it." She stood at the table for a moment after he turned away, her hands at her sides, and the wall she had built was still there, every stone of it, but one of them was warm to the touch now from the outside, and she did not know what to do with that. It was the 11th night when she finally asked. She had told herself she would not. She had told herself she was above it, that the drawer was his business and his secrets were his property, and she of all people understood the right to withhold. But she had also spent 11 days watching him wipe that drawer down each morning with a clean rag, just once, just quickly when he thought she was outside, and she was done pretending she had not noticed. "The drawer," she said. He was at the table with his maps. His hand stopped moving. "You wipe it every morning," she said. "Before anything else, before coffee, before the fire, you wipe it." A long silence. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was lit in deep amber, his face half in shadow, his hands flat on the table. Then he stood up, crossed to the workbench, pulled a key from around his neck. She had not seen it. It hung under his shirt, and fitted it to the lock. The drawer opened without sound. Inside, folded in a square of brown wool cloth, worn soft with years of handling, a badge, a Deputy United States Marshal's badge. The tin was dark with age. One corner was bent. The pin on the back had been broken off and never repaired. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The smell of coal smoke swept through the room, and underneath it, something older, gun oil, leather, the particular cold air of another state and another year. And for a moment the amber firelight seemed to dim, and in its place was the hard white light of a Wyoming courthouse, 10 years gone, a younger man standing before a desk while his superior read charges against him in a flat and certain voice. Jasper picked up the badge, held it in his palm. "I was a deputy marshal in Wyoming," he said. "Casper. Served 7 years. His thumb moved across the surface of the tin, slow. "My superior was taking money from a land syndicate, looking the other way on fraudulent titles, pressuring small ranchers off their deeds. I found the ledgers." He paused. "Sound familiar?" She did not breathe. "I filed a report. He filed one back, faster." His hand closed around the badge. "They charged me with the same crimes I'd reported, easier than investigating a senior officer. Cleaner." He looked up at her. "I had a choice. Stand trial and lose or disappear." "You disappeared?" "I disappeared?" He set the badge back in the drawer, folded the cloth back over it, but he did not close the drawer. "I wipe it," he said, "so I don't forget what it cost." He looked at the badge a moment longer. "Oh, and so I don't forget what I was before the cost." Violet looked at the badge in its square of wool, then at the man who had carried it 6 years up a mountain and locked it in an iron drawer and gotten up every morning to remind himself it was still there. She thought of her copied ledgers wrapped in oilcloth in the false bottom of her bag. She thought of March, of Denver, of the expression on Denton's face when he had come to take her statement, and understood in 2 minutes flat exactly what she had and exactly how dangerous it was. She looked at Jasper Colton, blacksmith, former lawman, fugitive, the man who had put his coat around her shoulders in the snow without asking permission and built her fire before dawn without making a sermon of it. She counted him. She stopped counting exits just for a moment, just enough to feel the difference. "We have the same enemies," she said quietly. He looked at her across the open drawer. "Yes," he said. "We do?" They heard the horses on the 12th morning. Not one horse. 3. Violet was outside at the water basin when the sound came up the trail. The particular rhythm of shod hooves on frozen ground, unhurried, deliberate. The sound of men who were not lost and not looking, but arriving. She did not run inside. She set down the basin, dried her hands on her apron, and walked to the cabin door with the same measured step she used for everything, because running told people things about you that stillness did not. Jasper was already at the window. "Denton?" she asked. Not Denton. His jaw was set. The man riding point. Gray coat, black horse. "That's your uncle." She went to the window and stood beside him and looked. Raymond Ames had not changed in the 6 months since Denver. He was a compact, well-dressed man of 55, with silver hair and the kind of face that courtrooms and church socials had both found trustworthy for 3 decades. He rode with his back straight and his hands easy on the reins, and there was nothing in his posture that said he was doing anything other than paying a perfectly reasonable visit. That was what made him dangerous. The 2 men flanking him were not deputies. No badges, no federal markings. Hired, then. Raymond had always preferred hired men. They were easier to manage than sworn officers, and easier to dismiss afterward. Violet stepped back from the window. "He found us fast," she said. Denton's rider would have stopped at every settlement between Silver Creek and Denver." Jasper moved to the door, checked the latch. Someone talked. She thought of the boarding house, the woman at the desk who had watched her pay in coin and count her change twice. People remembered things like that. The details of a woman who was careful with money in a way that suggested she no longer had any room for mistakes. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and breathed once, slow and deliberate. Old habit, necessary habit. 3 knocks on the cabin door, spaced evenly. The knock of a man who had decided in advance to appear reasonable. "Miss Ames." Raymond's voice came through the wood, warm and measured. "Violet, I know you're in there. I've come a long way, and I'm not here to make trouble. I want to talk." She looked at Jasper. He looked back at her. The question in his eyes was not what should we do. It was what do you want to do? The difference mattered, and she noted it. She reached past him and opened the door. Raymond Ames stood on the step with his hat in his hands and his hired men 2 paces back, and he looked at his niece with an expression that had been carefully constructed to resemble relief. She had seen him construct expressions her entire life. She knew the architecture of this one, the slight loosening around the eyes, the controlled exhale, the way he held the hat brim in both hands as if it were something fragile. She had also, at 14, watched him construct that exact expression for a rancher whose deed he was in the process of forging. "Thank God you're safe," Raymond said. "What do you want?" she said. Not a question. His eyes moved to Jasper, measured him the way men measure other men when they are deciding how much of a problem they present. Whatever conclusion he reached, he filed it without showing it. "There's been a misunderstanding," Raymond said, "with the marshals. I've spoken to Denton. The charges against you can be dropped, all of them. I have the authority to make that happen." He paused. "I only need one thing from you." "The copies," she said. He smiled. It was a good smile. It always had been. "You were always the sharpest one in the family, Violet. Come home. Bring what you took. We put this behind us, and no one needs to know any of it happened." The wind moved through the pines above the cabin. One of the hired men shifted his weight, and leather creaked. Jasper had not moved from her left side. He stood with his arms loose and his hands open and his eyes on the 2 hired men with the patient, absolute attention of someone who had done this before and was not impressed. Violet looked at her uncle. She thought of the ledgers. 47 separate transactions, each one a family dispossessed, a signature forged, a small life built on a piece of land that Raymond had sold twice to 2 different people and collected from both. She had copied every page by lamplight over 3 nights while Raymond slept, her hand cramping, the lamp turned low, listening to the floorboards. She thought of the rancher at the kitchen table when she was 14, the way he had thanked Raymond for his patience and understanding, the way Raymond had shaken his hand and smiled that same smile, and then, when the man was gone, turned back to his dinner without a word. She thought of Denton's face in the Denver marshal's office, 2 seconds after she'd laid her copies on his desk. That flash of calculation quickly smoothed, and the way he'd told her to wait in the hall and then locked the office door from the inside. She had not waited. "No," she said. Raymond's smile did not waver. That was the tell. A real smile changes when it hears the word no. His did not. "Violet, you bribed 4 federal officers," she said. "You forged title deeds on 31 parcels across 3 territories. You had me charged with crimes you commissioned yourself to protect men who are already criminals." She heard her own voice, flat, precise, no heat in it, just the weight of specifics. "There's nothing to discuss." Raymond looked at her for a moment with his real face, the one that lived behind the courtroom smile, and it was a colder thing than she had remembered. Then he looked at Jasper. "Mr. Colton," he said pleasantly, "you've put yourself in a complicated position for a woman you met less than 2 weeks ago. That's either very noble or very foolish." He turned his hat in his hands. "The marshals are aware that someone claiming to be her husband intervened in a federal matter in Silver Creek. That makes you an accessory. Interfering with federal officers carries a significant sentence." A pause, measured and deliberate. "Unless, of course, the matter were resolved quietly." Jasper looked at him the way the mountain looked at the weather, present, unmoved, waiting for it to finish. "You're welcome to leave the way you came," Jasper said, "before the trail gets dark." Raymond's eyes went cold, just for a second. Then the smile returned, smaller now, finished with warmth. "I'll be back," he said, "with the proper paperwork." He set his hat back on his head with the care of a man who is accustomed to having the last word. "Think carefully about what you're protecting, Violet. A man with a secret is not the same as a man you can trust." He turned and walked back to his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and did not move until the sound of hooves had faded completely down the trail and the pines had swallowed the last of it. Then she turned and went back inside. Jasper closed the door and dropped the latch bar and stood with his back to the wood and looked at her. And for once his face was not entirely closed. There was something in it. Not worry, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something that had her name on it. She sat down at the table. "He'll go to Denton," she said. "Denton will come with actual paperwork this time. A real warrant, or something that looks enough like one." She pressed her palms flat on the table. "We have maybe 2 days." "Maybe 1, Jasper said. She looked at her hands, then at the iron drawer under the workbench, closed now, the key back under his shirt. There are moments when the wall you have built with such precision and such patience and such very good reasons becomes less useful than the person standing on the other side of it, not because the wall was wrong, not because the reasons were wrong, but because you have finally, after 11 days of cataloging and testing and watching a man from the corner of your eye, accumulated enough evidence to reach a conclusion. She was not a woman who ignored evidence. She looked up at him. "Tell me what you know about Judge Samuel Morris," she said. Something shifted in his face. "How do you know that name?" "My uncle is afraid of 3 things," she said. "Federal investigation, losing money, and Samuel Morris. His name appears in the ledgers twice, not as a participant, as a threat. Raymond noted every time Morris was within circuit-riding distance of his transactions." She paused. "A man who keeps a record of the one judge he's afraid of is a man who knows that judge is honest." Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the table and sat down across from her, and she could see him making a decision in the stillness of his face, turning something over, measuring it. "Morris rides the Northern Circuit," he said finally. "He's been trying to build a case against the Denver Land Office for 2 years. He doesn't have enough. The documentation keeps disappearing before it reaches him." He looked at her. "He needs original records, not copies." "I have copies." "Copies can be challenged." "I know where the originals are." She met his eyes. Raymond's office, back wall, behind the surveyor's cabinet. He never moved them because he never believed anyone would get close enough to matter. The fire had burned low. Outside, the afternoon wind had come up, moving through the high pines with that low, patient sound that had become, over 12 days, the specific sound of this place and no other. Jasper leaned forward on the table. "If we ride for the Northern Circuit station," he said slowly, "we have maybe 36 hours before Denton files a material witness warrant, and every settlement between here and there is watching for us. I know. And if Morris isn't there—" "He'll be there," she said. "He rides the circuit like a clock. Raymond's ledger says so." He looked at her across the table with those dark, steady eyes, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. We are not always afraid of the person in front of us. Sometimes we are afraid of every person who stood there before them, every hand that promised safety and delivered something else, every smile that was constructed rather than felt. The courage it takes to look at someone new and choose, with full knowledge of the cost, just to believe them, that is not a small courage. That is the hardest kind. "All right," Jasper said. 2 words. She felt them settle somewhere below her ribs. "We leave at first light," she said. He nodded once and stood and went to the stove, and she watched his back and the set of his shoulders and the way he moved through the small cabin with that unhurried, absolute certainty that she had spent 12 days trying to find the calculation in. She was beginning to think there was no calculation. That was the most frightening thing he had done yet. They did not make it to first light. Denton came at midnight. Violet heard them before the horses were visible, the particular silence that falls over a forest when too many men move through it at once. Every night, creature going still, the pines holding their breath. She was awake, so she had not slept. She was sitting at the table with her oilcloth bundle in her lap and her coat already on when the first torch appeared between the trees at the bottom of the trail. She crossed to the blanket dividing the room and said his name once, quietly. He was already awake. She heard the sound of boots on the floor before she finished the word. She went to the window. 4 torches. No, 5. And behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of Raymond Ames on his black horse, sitting back from the group the way men sit when they have paid for the risk and prefer to watch others carry it. Jasper appeared at her shoulder. She felt the warmth of him before she heard him. That had been happening for 3 days now, that particular awareness, and she had stopped cataloging it because cataloging it did not help. 5 men, she said. Denton and 2 deputies plus Raymond's 2 hired. She paused. And Raymond. 6. His voice was low. There's another one at the tree line, east side. Been there 10 minutes. She had not seen the 6th. She noted that and filed it. He saw things on terrain the way she saw things in rooms. A different kind of watchfulness built from a different kind of history. They'll try to talk first, she said. Raymond will want the copies before anyone does anything irreversible. And if we give him the copies, she looked at him, then we disappear, quietly. And in 6 months, Raymond sells the same parcels a 3rd time, and 2 more families lose everything they built, and Denton files another cooperative report, and Morris never gets close enough. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then we don't give him the copies. She reached into her coat and pressed the oilcloth bundle into his hands. If something goes wrong, you ride north. Don't stop at Silver Creek. Don't stop anywhere you've been seen with me. Get to Morris." He looked at the bundle in his hands, then at her. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he said, and the quiet certainty in it was not bravado. It was the voice of a man making a decision he intended to honor. He tucked the bundle inside his coat, against his chest. 3 heavy knocks on the cabin door, the knock from 2 nights ago, spaced, deliberate, performing reasonableness. Colton. Denton's voice, not Raymond's this time. "Open the door. I have a warrant for the arrest of Violet Ames on charges of theft and assault of a federal officer. Open the door, and this goes easy. I'd make me come in, and it goes hard." Jasper looked at Violet. She straightened her coat, lifted her chin, counted the distance from the door to the tree line one more time in her head. 30 feet of open ground, frozen, no cover. And then she stopped counting it. She was done running. "Open it," she said. He lifted the latch bar and pulled the door wide. The cold came in first, a wall of it, and then the torchlight, orange and unsteady, and then Denton himself, 3 steps into the doorway. A narrow-faced man in a federal coat, his badge catching the flame, his right hand loose near his holster, with the practiced casualness of someone who wanted it noticed without appearing to intend it. Behind him, his 2 deputies fanned across the clearing. Raymond's hired men stayed back near the horses. Raymond himself had not dismounted. "Oh, Miss Ames." Denton's eyes found her immediately. "Step outside." "Show me the warrant," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, held it up, did not hand it to her. "Signed this morning by federal magistrate in Denver. You're coming with me." "Let me read it." "It's not a negotiation. Marshal Denton." Her voice was level and precise, the voice she had used in the land office, the voice she had built over years of sitting across tables from men who assumed her silence was consent. A warrant that cannot withstand 30 seconds of reading is not a warrant. It is a prop, and you know the difference. Something moved in Denton's face. Not anger, calculation. Jasper had not moved from the doorframe. He stood with his arms at his sides and his shoulders square and his eyes moving steadily between Denton and the 2 deputies in the clearing. And he was very still in the way that large, capable men go still when they are deciding which problem to solve first. Denton took 1 step forward. Jasper filled the doorframe, not aggressively, simply completely, the way a door fills a frame, wall to wall, top to bottom, no gap remaining. "The lady asked to read it," Jasper said. Denton looked up at him. The calculation ran again, faster this time. 5 men, 6, counting Raymond, against 1 blacksmith in a cabin doorway. The arithmetic should have been simple. It was not simple. Something in Jasper Colton's stillness made it not simple. And Denton was experienced enough to know what that something was. The specific quality of a man who had already decided what he would and would not do, and had made his peace with it, and was no longer afraid of the answer. Raymond Ames walked his horse forward. "Enough," he said pleasantly. "Jasper, may I call you Jasper?" He did not wait for an answer. "You are an intelligent man, and you have built a careful life up here. Don't sacrifice it for a woman who brought this trouble on herself." His eyes moved to Violet. "And you know what you have is not enough. Copies of ledgers, no chain of custody, no corroborating witnesses. Any competent attorney dismantles it in an afternoon. Come home. This ends tonight." Violet looked at her uncle on his black horse with his straight back and his reasonable voice and his hired men at the tree line, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 months of running. Stillness. Not the stillness of defeat. The stillness of a woman who has finally stopped moving long enough to know exactly where she stands and exactly what she is willing to do about it. She stepped forward, past Jasper, into the cold of the clearing. "You sold the Hendersons' land twice," she said. Her voice carried in the cold air, clear and without tremor. "The Morales family lost their deed on a parcel they had worked for 11 years because you sold it to a railroad speculator 6 months before the ink on their title was dry. The Callahan brothers, 3 of them, Marshal, all with families, were removed from their homestead by deputies who were following forged eviction orders that my uncle paid to have processed in under 48 hours. She paused. "I have the dates, the amounts, the names of every federal official who received payment, and I have been carrying that information for 6 months across 4 territories, and I am still standing here." The clearing was very quiet. One of Denton's deputies shifted. The hired man at the east tree line had gone still. Raymond's pleasant expression had not moved, but the hands on his reins had tightened, and she could see it from 20 feet away because she had spent 18 years watching his hands when his face lied. "Arrest her," Raymond said to Denton. "Quiet. Final." Denton reached for her arm. Jasper moved, not fast, or rather, not what most men would call fast, but with the total absence of wasted motion that made it feel inevitable, the way a door closes when the wind is right. He stepped between Denton and Violet, and his hand came up and caught Denton's wrist. Not striking, not threatening, simply stopping it in the air between them with a grip that the marshal tested once and then stopped testing. "Don't," Jasper said. One word. The same word he had used about the drawer. Low, absolute, carrying the full weight of a man who had said it before in circumstances that had required him to mean it. The second deputy's hand went to his holster. Violet turned, and she saw it, and she did not think. She stepped to the deputy's right, took hold of his wrist with both hands before the gun clears leather, and she turned it, not with strength but with the precise mechanical leverage her uncle's cook had taught her for a different purpose entirely, and the gun dropped into the dirt. The deputy stared at her. She stared back. Silence. Then, from the trail below the clearing, hoofbeats. More than one horse. Coming fast. Every head turned. 3 riders broke from the tree line, and the man at the front was not a marshal and not a hired man. He was older, lean, dressed in a dark coat with no badge, but carrying himself with the particular authority of someone who has never needed one. Behind him, 2 men with the look of federal clerks, one of them holding a leather document case across his saddle. Raymond Ames went completely still on his horse. Judge Samuel Morris pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the assembled scene. The torches, the dropped gun, Jasper's hand around Denton's wrist, Violet standing in the frozen dirt with her chin up and her coat open in the cold. And he took it in with the measured patience of a man who had been riding circuits for 20 years and had seen most of what humans were capable of arranging for one another. "Marshal Denton," Morris said, "release whatever you're holding and step back." Denton looked at Raymond. Raymond said nothing. "Step back," Morris said, and this time it was not a direction but a wall, and Denton stepped back. Morris dismounted. He was not a tall man, but the clearing organized itself around him the way clearings do around men who have decided how things are going to go. He walked toward Violet with his hand out, not to shake, but palm up, asking. She reached into her coat, hesitated 1/2 second, not from doubt, but from the weight of 6 months in her hands, the specific gravity of everything she had carried. Then she placed the oilcloth bundle in his palm. He looked at it, then at her. "Miss Ames," he said, "I've been looking for this for 2 years." He unwrapped the oilcloth with care, opened the first folded page, read 3 lines. His jaw tightened. "You carried this alone?" "Yes, sir." He looked at Raymond. "Raymond Ames, you are under arrest on charges of land fraud, forgery of federal documents, and bribery of United States marshal officers." He nodded to the 2 men behind him. "Get him down." Raymond did not move for a moment. Yet he sat on his black horse and looked at his niece across the torchlit clearing with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, not the constructed warmth of the courtroom smile. Something that looked, for just a second, like recognition. Then the riders were beside him, and he dismounted, and he was diminished, somehow, the moment his feet touched the ground. Shorter than he had seemed on horseback, older, the silver hair less distinguished in the torchlight, and more simply gray. She watched them take him across the clearing without moving. Jasper appeared at her side. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, and she was grateful for it in a way she did not have words for and did not try to find words for. Morris turned to Denton. "Your badge, Marshal." Denton's face went through several things quickly, none of them pleasant. Then he unpinned the badge from his coat and held it out, and Morris took it the way you take something contaminated, between 2 fingers, without looking at it, setting it in his coat pocket to be dealt with later. The second deputy surrendered his without being asked. The hired men had already faded back into the trees. Raymond's horse stood riderless at the edge of the clearing, indifferent. Morris looked at Jasper. "And you are?" "Jasper Colton," Jasper said. "Blacksmith, Silver Creek." Morris looked at him for a long moment with the particular attention of a man who has learned to look past what people say they are. "Is that so?" he said, in the tone of a man filing something away for later. "Yes." "Sir," Jasper said, and held the judge's gaze without blinking. Morris almost smiled. "We'll talk in the morning," he said, and turned back to his clerks. The torches went out one by one as Denton's men withdrew, and the clearing returned to moonlight. Pale and clean, the frozen ground blue-white, the pines black against a sky full of cold stars. The sound of horses moving down the trail diminished and then was gone, and the forest night sounds returned cautiously. A branch settling, the far-off complaint of an owl, the wind resuming in the high branches with that low, patient voice that had become, over 13 nights, the specific sound of this mountain and no other. Violet stood in the clearing and breathed, in and out, once, twice, 6 months of moving, 6 months of counting exits and watching road dust for riders and sleeping in 2-hour intervals and holding everything she knew in a bundle of oilcloth against her chest like something she could not afford to put down. 6 months of being a woman with dangerous knowledge in a territory full of men who had decided that made her the criminal. She breathed out slowly, and something went with the breath that she had not known she was still carrying. Jasper stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a moment she looked up at him. His face was turned toward the trail where the torches had gone, and in the moonlight he looked like what he was, a large, scarred, quiet man on a mountain in a clearing, at the end of something that had cost him considerably more than a blacksmith had any reason to pay. "You knew Morris was coming," she said. He was quiet for a second. "I sent a rider north 2 days ago." She stared at him. "Before Raymond came." Before Raymond came? She thought about that. About the morning she had woken to find the fire already built and the coffee already on the stove. About the coat placed over her shoulders in the snow. About the pot steadied without being asked, and the coffee cup placed close, and the mule given up without discussion. About a man who had spent 6 years on a mountain practicing the particular discipline of doing what needed to be done without announcing that he was doing it. "You could have told me," she said. "You would have argued," he said. The corner of his mouth moved just barely. "About the strategy." She looked at him for a long moment. "I would have," she admitted. The wind moved through the pines, and the stars were very bright, and the clearing was entirely quiet, and she was, for the first time in 6 months, not counting anything at all. They went inside. Jasper built the fire up without being asked, and the cabin filled slowly with warmth, the kind that starts at the floor and rises, unhurried, the way good things tend to arrive. Violet sat at the table and did not take her coat off for a long time, not because she was cold, because sitting still felt unfamiliar, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. The fire crackled. Outside the wind had gentled. After a while Jasper crossed to the workbench. He pulled the key from around his neck, fitted it to the lock, and opened the iron drawer for the second time. He unwrapped the badge from its square of brown wool, and he set it on the table between them. She looked at it. The bent corner, the broken pin on the back, the surface dark with years of careful tending. "Morris will want to talk to you tomorrow," she said quietly, "about Wyoming." "I know. It could go well." She paused. "The documentation I have. It establishes a pattern. Corrupt officers filing countercharges to silence witnesses. What happened to you and Casper fits the same architecture." She looked up at him. "You don't have to stay disappeared." He was looking at the badge. Something moved across his face. Not hope exactly, but the cautious, careful thing that lives just underneath hope in people who have learned not to spend it recklessly. He reached across the table, not for the badge. His hand came to rest over hers, warm and certain, the way it had been over the cast-iron pot, except this time he did not move it away. She looked at his hand over hers. She did not move hers either. She had counted every exit in every room she had entered for 6 months. She had catalogued every face and tested every kindness and held every door at arm's length until she understood the mechanism of it. She had been, by every measure she respected, thorough, and this man had rebuilt a fire every morning before she woke, and given up the better horse without comment, and sent a rider north 2 days before she thought to suggest it. She turned her hand over beneath his. It was a small gesture, quiet, entirely her own choice and entirely without calculation, and that was how she knew it was real. "You're safe here," he said, low and even, not performing it. She looked at the fire, at the badge on the table, at the window, where the first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. "I know," she said. And she did. Outside, Silver Creek Valley lay quiet under its scatter of cold stars, and the pines stood as they always stood, patient, indifferent to weather, built to last. Somewhere down the trail, Raymond Ames was in custody, and Denton's badge was in a judge's coat pocket, and 6 months of running had arrived without announcement at a table beside a fire in a cabin on a mountain. She did not ask what came next. For the first time in a very long time, she did not need to know. There is something this story keeps returning to, quietly, without making a speech of it. Not justice, though justice arrived. Not courage, although there was courage in that clearing and in that land office in Denver and in every mile of road between them. What this story is really about is simpler and harder than either of those things. It is about what we carry. Violet Ames carried 47 transactions in an oilcloth bundle for 6 months across 4 territories. She carried them when she was hungry and when she was cold, and when the smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to let them go and find a quiet town and a quiet life and stop making herself a target. She carried them because she had looked into the faces of the people those pages represented, the Hendersons, the Morales family, the Callahan brothers, and she understood that the difference between a document and a life is only the person willing to stand behind it. Jasper Colton carried a badge in a locked iron drawer for 6 years, not because he was waiting for rescue, not because he believed the system that had broken him would repair itself, but because he needed to remember every single morning that he had once stood for something worth standing for, and that the act of remembering was itself a form of resistance. 2 people carrying different things up the same mountain, that is not a coincidence the story invented. That is something older than fiction. We are drawn, more often than we understand, toward the people who are carrying the same weight we are, not because misery seeks company, but because only someone who knows the specific gravity of a thing can understand what it costs to keep holding it. And sometimes, in the most unlikely clearing, in the middle of the most unlikely night, you look across at the person beside you and realize they have been holding their end of it longer than you knew. Violet stopped counting exits, not because the world became safe, not because she stopped being the woman who catalogs and tests and measures, but because she had finally accumulated enough evidence to reach a conclusion she trusted. That is not a small thing. For some of us, it is the longest journey we will ever make. Wherever you are listening to this, whatever town, whatever country, whatever quiet corner of the world you have found for yourself tonight, I hope you are somewhere warm. And if you are carrying something heavy, I hope you are not carrying it alone,